Hi, this is Dale Crosby from Training Beyond Accounting. Welcome to the Engage program, where we invite thought leaders within public practice accounting to discuss how accounting firms are taking on a stronger advisory focus. Over the course of this program, we'll be considering how accounting firms can really engage their clients through value-added services. I'd like to begin the session by welcoming our guest presenter today, David Bates. David is Managing Director of Workforce Guardian, Australia's leading HR and employment relations service for employers. David provides a wide range of strategic, practical and plain English employment relations advice and support to Australian business owners and operators. Welcome, David.
G'day, Dale. How are you going?
No, very good, thank you. David, in this session we'll be discussing how HR advice, specifically in relation to workplace health and safety compliance, can be incorporated into the business advisory platform of any accounting firm. Can I start by asking, from your perspective, what role should accounting firms play in the delivery of HR advice to their business clients? What's appropriate?
Well, I think it's increasingly the case that clients are asking their accountants for advice, and I suppose what it comes down to is the level of confidence that those firms have in providing advice that's a little bit outside of the usual remit, if you like. Things like workplace health and safety and HR, they do sort of seem separate from the types of services that accounting firms might be providing or advising on. But I think it is the case that people are more and more seeing their accountants as being a one-stop shop. And so I think it's important that accounting firms do try and diversify the suite of services that they offer.
Yeah, and certainly a good point you make is in relation to areas of specialty. Obviously, you wouldn't expect in every accounting practice there's going to be an HR expert, but practices can certainly draw on external support like Workforce Guardian to deliver these this advice to clients.
Exactly right, and I think it's those sorts of partnerships which really do make a difference. People go and find an accounting firm that matches, the requirements of their business, and they will inquire about the suite of services that those accounting firms can provide. And the accounting firm itself can't obviously be an expert in every single area of business management and practice, but they can certainly align themselves with different organisations which do specialise in those areas and then leverage that relationship so that effectively for the client it's a seamless service.
Yes, certainly. And Workforce Guardian is one of those services that's available. Can you describe how the relationship between Workforce Guardian and accounting firms actually works from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. We've got two different ways that we really connect in with accounting firms right across the country. One of the ways that we do that is by, first of all, forming a strategic partnership with accounting firms so that when they have a client who might raise with them questions relating to payroll or terms and conditions of employment, and they are doing that increasingly often, it means that the accounting firms can then draw on our expertise to provide advice back to the client. So in some cases, for example, during the annual review with a client, the accountant might become aware of the fact that the client doesn't really know how much their employees must be paid under the legislation. And so in order to find that information, they can come to us, and we'll certainly assist them with finding it, or indeed they might just advise the client to subscribe to one of the services that we offer directly to the business. And through that subscription service, the accounting firm can assist their client to find the information they need. The second aspect is through what we call an HR advice online service, where the accounting firm themselves subscribe to our product, and then what they're able to do is to leverage that to find or provide written responses to the client every time they come up with these questions. And we do see that happening usually during the annual review process.
Yes, obviously there's real opportunity to add value through helping clients to address HR issues as they come up. What about the underlying issues of helping firms put together HR policies and procedures, things like performance review, position descriptions? How can a product like Workforce Guardian help in those sorts of areas?
Yeah, well, the reality is that we have these incredibly complex employment laws in Australia. And so employers, especially in white-collar businesses or in professional services like accounting firms, quite often, even though you're across a whole range of different areas, it's virtually impossible to keep on top of the complexities in the legislation. And those complexities actually go down through things like performance review processes because, as you might be aware, we're seeing a surge in claims for workplace bullying and a whole range of other types of claims which are arising from changes in the Fair Work Act. So I think it's really important that expert advice always be on hand because those sorts of day-to-day HR issues that most employers are dealing with do in fact have a direct tie-in to the legislation. And not being aware of your obligations through things like proper performance management can really result in some significant risk down the track.
Yeah, and I think like many of these tools, probably the best place for an accounting firm to start is with their own firm and make sure that they've got the proper processes and systems in place to address their own HR issues and policies.
Yeah, that's right, and that's where we usually start. So quite often when we have our first interaction with an accounting firm, we might meet them, for example, at a trade show or some other event, and they'll come over to our stand. And even though they might begin by talking about some of the issues that their clients raise with them, which create questions relating to payroll or employment law, quite often we very quickly then start turning to their own problems inside the practices themselves. And firms have all kinds of, standard HR issues that arise, whether it be performance management, terms and conditions of employment, leave, absences, a whole range of issues. And so, yeah, you're quite right, Dale. Quite often we start off by talking about the accounting firm's own issues and addressing those, and then in turn we start looking at the issues that their clients face. So it's often a two-step process.
Yeah, and that gives them the confidence to be able to then provide that same sort of service to their clients because they understand exactly what's involved and how it works.
Exactly.
Yep. Okay, so can we move on and talk a little bit about clients' options for accessing advice? I mean, my perception is that for many small business clients, their accountant may not necessarily be the first person they'd go to, or that perhaps they wouldn't think of their accounting firm as the provider of these sorts of services. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of your experience in that area? I mean, obviously clients will go to certain places to get that information. How can accounting firms really get involved in that mix and present themselves as people to go to for this sort of information?
I think the starting point is that when accounting firms are providing advice specifically to small and medium-sized businesses, they're going to be looking obviously at things like compliance with taxation legislation, the filing of the BAS statements, all of those sorts of things, including obviously the taxation implications of those. And that's the core, certainly the historical core of the advice that an accounting firm would provide. But indeed, it follows on from that there's going to be a whole range of things that the client also needs to consider from an employment law perspective, and they also have accounting implications. So you can't, for example, calculate how much pay or super should be being paid unless you know what the source of those obligations and entitlements are. And quite often what happens then is even though the client doesn't necessarily think of their accountant as being the place that they should go to get this sort of advice, in the course of obtaining the standard type of accounting advice, they then suddenly start asking questions which on the surface appear quite straightforward payroll questions, but of course they actually go to quite complex legal questions relating to the Fair Work Act. And so quite often that's where the starting point is, that all of a sudden the accountant does get put on the spot and they are expected to have some of these answers. And at the end of the day, the alternatives for the client are quite limited because if they don't speak to their accountant about it, who they already regard, of course, as a trusted advisor, that's the person they're going to for setting up their business sometimes, for the structure of it, and then for all of these taxation and other liability advice questions, they're really only going to go otherwise to a solicitor, which could be extremely expensive. They could go to the Fair Work info line or to the Fair Work Ombudsman's own website, and the feedback about those resources is quite mixed. And of course, it is worth noting that the Fair Work Ombudsman, of course, provides advice both to employers and employees. So it's not necessarily ideal for providing strategic advice to people trying to set up or run a business. So there are limited options of where they can go, and sometimes what they end up doing is sort of stumbling into the advice during that conversation with their accountant.
Yes, and maybe as I often talk to accountants about, their challenge is to open up conversations, to ask clients questions that actually help them to understand what challenges the clients have got in their business so that some of these issues are raised. Because often I suspect in the course of conversation on tax and accounting, some of these issues might be presented at a peripheral level, but unless the client manager explores them in more detail, probably the real issues sometimes don't come out.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and if we use the example of pay rates just as a really classic and straightforward example, the client will almost certainly be discussing their payroll tax obligations and whether or not a particular amount counts as ordinary time earnings for super purposes. All of those sorts of conversations go on with their accountant all the time. And if we just take one step back, as I mentioned before, of course, what we're looking at is where is the source of that pay entitlement. So it's all very well and good to be talking about taxation liabilities of a pay rate. However, how did you determine the correct pay rate is? And I'd say 9 times out of 10, small and medium-sized business owners, even though they're making sure that they're compliant with things like their tax and VAT obligations, they're not complying with their obligations under things like modern awards. And so unless you're ticking off both of those boxes in unison, there's a real risk of non-compliance, and that's really where we step in.
Yeah, and I know from my own experience it's very hard to keep up to date with it. I try to provide HR advice to my clients where it's appropriate, but I've learned from experience that I need a resource like HR advice online to make sure that I get the right information. Sometimes it feels as though you can ask 3 different people and get 3 different responses. So it's important to have that expert looking over, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, and that feedback that you've just mentioned, I mean, that was critical to the setting up of our service. We have what we call an advice philosophy, and others that do a similar type of work to the one that we do here at Workforce Guardian, they share that philosophy, and that is to make sure that the advice we provide is clear, it's in plain English, it's very practical. There's no point giving theoretical or legal responses to a small business owner who just wants a yes or no answer to a question. And it's also really important, of course, that the advice that they receive is consistent and accurate. So, we really strive to do that. It's very important.
Yeah, absolutely. David, can you give me some feedback how a firm can leverage some of this advice, obviously as an extension of the firm's suite of advisory services, but how to get some value out of this service for the firm in terms of fees? How would that process work?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of different ways that accounting firms can do it. One of the beautiful things about our business is that because we're relatively small in terms of internal staffing, we're able to be very flexible with the partners we work with. So there's all different types of ways that we can tailor the service. But essentially what most accounting firms do is they effectively bundle the cost of their HR advice subscription into the cost that they pass on to their clients. So when they provide a list of the services that they're willing to offer the client, they can incorporate HR into that list by way of the providing of advice from Workforce Guardian. They can build that cost into the client cost and therefore create a revenue stream directly back into the accounting firm itself. We also obviously work very hard to make sure that the advice we provide is always 100% on the money, and one of the other benefits of that service for the accounting firm is because the liability of that advice will always rest with us here at Workforce Guardian. So we pass the information on in writing. The accounting firm can then pass that on in confidence to their client, knowing, of course, that they're not going to be personally liable for it. So there is an opportunity for an accounting firm to generate a revenue stream without a corresponding liability.
Yeah, and that peace of mind is really important. Okay, fantastic. You've got a couple of case studies here. Can we just go through those? And again, it'll just help listeners understand how this process works. So let's start with case study 1, client operating an Australian division of an international retail business.
Yeah, this is a great example because this particular business operates in about 15 different countries around the world. And they import a certain type of product and then they on-sell it to the market here in Australia via a retail operation. And we were introduced to this business, and it was me personally. I was introduced to the business by way of their accountant, who came to me and said, look, I've got some concerns because when I did my annual review with this client, they flagged that there was this ongoing investigation being conducted by the Fair Work Ombudsman into the rates of pay and terms and conditions that were being provided. And so the accountant flagged with me that this had been going on for more than 6 months. It was obviously becoming quite an expensive, time-consuming, and apart from anything else, stressful exercise for the employer. So they asked if we could meet with their client directly with a view to engaging our services, our consulting services, and then assisting them with this particular investigation. And that's exactly what we did. We stepped in. We were appointed to act on their behalf as a professional organisation. We worked with the Fair Work Ombudsman to effectively resolve the issues that had been flagged and that had been subject to this investigation. And then we liaised backwards and forwards with the accounting firm. So effectively, from the client's point of view, it was a seamless service. Their accountants were dealing with the financial affairs of the business and we were dealing with the HR and legal liability in relation to Fair Work compliance aspects. So for the client, it was a nice one-stop shop and certainly it provided a much faster, I think, resolution than would otherwise have been the case.
Yeah, so it's a good example of an accountant as client manager really taking control of the issue, managing the issue, but bringing in the external experts to provide the technical advice.
Precisely, yeah. The realisation by the accountant that they didn't themselves have the ability to deal with the types of issues or to respond to the types of issues that were being investigated. But by working in partnership with us, we were able to very effectively, in combination, address those concerns.
Okay. Case study 2, can you tell me about this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, this was a client that was introduced to us also following an annual review by the accountant. It's often the way that it goes. And the accountant was concerned in this case with the client's compliance with the Fair Work Act and with 2 specific modern awards that the accountant had a view probably applied to this particular business's operations. And so this is a great example of an accountant who's already thought outside the box and realised that the advice that they're providing to their clients can't just necessarily be limited to, taxation or the standard types of matters. Sometimes there are other liabilities which are going to exist there, for example, under modern award. And when they flagged this particular modern award issue with the client then obviously indicated to the accountant that they didn't know what a modern award was, let alone which ones applied in their workplace. So the accountant approached us, and again, we worked with the accountant to provide a full review of this particular business's practices right across the board, their terms and conditions of employment, their contracts that they've issued, their pay rates, etc. And we did identify some urgent changes that were required because in our view there were some awards that applied that the employer hadn't realised. And what we were able to do with the accounting firm was to obviously provide full compliance and then peace of mind for the business owner. So all of a sudden, these liabilities and risks had been comprehensively addressed. And that's where that quote came from. The business owner said, this is great because the accountant is effectively taking care of my money and my people, because by working in partnership with us, we were able to deal with their 2 biggest issues, which were their financial liabilities and their HR liabilities.
Yes, a fantastic way of showing the accountant taking on that role of trusted advisor, again, without necessarily having the technical capability to solve the problem, but the client perceives the accountant's managing the issue, which is great. David, in the course of this session, we've talked about Workforce Guardian and HR Advice Online. Can you talk about the differences between the two? HR Advice Online to me seems to be more a service that accountants can use themselves without necessarily having to bring in an external party from the client's perspective.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dale. So the 2 different types of service that we offer through the accounting channel, one of them is the subscription product for the small business clients themselves. So that's a service that the accountant can recommend it to their client and say, for example, I think that you need to have a comprehensive HR system to ensure compliance, and I would endorse this product from Workforce Guardian, and you can go off and subscribe to it. The second product, or the second type of service that we offer, is one that's actually for the accountant themselves to subscribe to, or their firm to subscribe to. And as you've identified, it's called HR Advice Online from Workforce Guardian. And this is a fairly unique service because effectively it's the accountant that subscribes, but the accountant then is able to use that subscription to obtain answers to all of their clients' HR-related questions. So each time the accountant is sitting down or taking a call or even reviewing their emails from one of their clients, if the client's raising HR-related questions, for example, can I take out a particular amount from an employee's final pay? Or, does my employee have a right to actually take this time as paid leave? These are the types of questions people sometimes ask the accountant, but which really go directly to the Fair Work Act. So when the accountant receives those questions, they can access the HR Advice Online service online, so they log into it, a portal, they cut and paste the client's question or they type it in themselves, they send it through to us, and then one of our experts will reply in writing within 2 working days. And as I mentioned before, the idea of that written service is that because it comes on our letterhead, the liability rests exclusively with us. It's clear to the end user, the small business or medium-sized business employer, that the advice has come from us via their accountant and that we are liable for it. It's a really nice way or easy way for employers to be able to access information via their account.
Yeah, and as you said, this information is provided in plain words, not in legal jargon, so it's easy to explain to the client.
Absolutely, and when the accountant actually submits the question to us, they have the option. They can indicate whether they want the response sent directly to their client or whether they want the response to be sent back to the accounting firm for them to forward on to the client. And interestingly, we thought it would be around a 50-50 split, but around 90% of the cases that we receive, the accountant actually wants to see the answer themselves first. And I'd suggest that in the long run, that's really going to be helpful because it means that the accountant is building up a level of knowledge, a level of familiarity with the Fair Work legislation, with their client's HR obligations. And I think in the long run, that's going to be a benefit to their client because it means that the accountant will also be able to identify potential risks or areas of liability much faster than they might be able to right now.
Absolutely, and the client also feels more confident in going back to their accountant for further advice, so it's a win-win.
Yeah.
Okay, as we come to the end of the session, can you give me some feedback on where you think the future lies in this sort of area? Obviously the HR advice online side, but also the role of advice providers like accountants in delivering the service. Where are we going with this?
Well, I think going forward that the issue of people management is going to be more and more important in a business, and that's because there is certainly no end in sight to the complexity of Australian employment law. So while other countries are sort of creating much more flexible workplaces, we seem to be doing the opposite in Australia. And I think necessarily that means the consequence of that is that we are going to have to make sure that we are always getting the best from the people that we have, because wages in Australia are high. It's difficult to dismiss underperforming people. So we need to effectively manage the people that we have. So people are going to become increasingly important and in an increasingly complex area of compliance under the Australian employment laws. So I think what that in turn means for accounting firms is that as businesses continue to come to them for strategic advice, the range of strategic advice that they're going to be asking for is going to continue to diversify. And I think HR and workplace health and safety, to some lesser extent, but I think certainly HR, is going to become an area that more and more clients are going to ask their accountants about. So I think that there is definitely a benefit for accounting firms in considering strategic alliances or even merging with other service providers to provide one-stop shops, to provide seamless service for those clients. So I certainly think this is an area that's only going to grow in importance, certainly not reduce in importance over the next, say, 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you see as the key steps, or what's the first step that an accounting firm should take if it's interested in working out ways to incorporate HR advice or workplace health and safety advice as part of their offering?
Well, I think the first thing to do is to always have a look at your own internal operations. We always recommend businesses, whether they be accounting firms or otherwise, conduct a self-compliance audit with the Fair Work Act. And there's material that you can access online that enable you to do that yourself. And I think a great starting point is for an accounting firm, for a practice manager, to have a look at whether or not their practice is compliant with the legislation. And I think when they start to dig down, they will very quickly realise that there is quite possibly a number of areas of non-compliance, whether it be with time and wages records, pay slips, or even modern award coverage for some of their employees. And when the firm themselves realise that they might not be 100% compliant, it really then becomes much easier to understand how difficult it is for their small business clients to comply. So I'd recommend a self-audit as a first step. Obviously, then you can address that via a direct subscription to our service for the accounting firm themselves. And then as a second step to that, if you are receiving lots of questions relating to HR from your clients, then why not consider a subscription to something like HR Advice Online from Workforce Guardian so that you can then answer those questions on your client's behalf.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. I don't know whether you've got access to any stats showing what proportion of small, medium-sized enterprise are actually fully compliant with national and state standards. I suspect a significant proportion are not.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Dale. And when I was on Sky News a few weeks ago on the Swifter program, I made the point that if we were to, walk out of the studio and walk down the street and knock on 10 business doors, I'd be surprised if one out of those 10 knew about, for example, the national employment standards and modern awards,
yes,
let alone was complying with them. I think there's a huge amount of information gap out there. Not the employer's fault by any means. It's just that it's so complex, it's impossible to be on top of. There's plenty of scope for improvement with compliance.
Most definitely. Thanks very much, David, for your input today and for your feedback on, I guess, obviously the value of this service to businesses, but also how accountants as trusted advisors can leverage this sort of service to add value to their clients. Where can accounting firms go for more information, obviously about your services, but about the implementation process?
For sure, yeah. There are two different ways that we can be contacted. You can visit us online at workforceguardian.com.au, and through that website we have a whole range of links to both the services and systems that we provide, including our partner program, which is for accounting firms. Or you can also call our friendly customer service team, 1300 659 563, the team that takes that call would be happy to talk the accountant through the different options that are available to their firm.
Fantastic. Thank you again, David, very much for your input into the session today.
It's been a pleasure, Dale. Thanks for having me.
No, my pleasure. For the audience, if you're interested in further information on how you can develop your advisory platform as an integrated platform, take a look at the Make It Happen coaching program at trainingbeyondaccounting.com.au. Thank you for attending today's session, and please take a look at our other recorded presentations in the Engage program. We'll see you soon. Thank you.